All right, we're back in business. Let's move on. So another type of connective tissue is bone. And we know that bone is not a loose connective tissue. Instead, it is a rigid connective tissue. And the matrix that the bone is part of is both made up of collagen and calcium salts, which makes sense because we know that we need calcium for our bones. So you see the salts surround protein fibers, which provide elasticity and strength. So it's hard to imagine, how our bone has some elasticity, but it is a pretty good absorber, like shock absorber, and that's because of this arrangement of the protein fibers and salts. So cells you might want to know, osteoblasts are the ones that are building up the bone. Osteoclasts are responsible for breaking down the bone or scrubbing the bone. So the interesting thing is our bone is an on-demand reservoir of calcium. So when we need more calcium in our blood for things like muscle contraction, then the osteoclasts are going to break down the bone and release calcium into the blood. When we need to build new bone, the osteoblasts then are going to absorb that calcium and build new bone. So it's this constant building and degrading away to ensure that you have enough calcium. This is a really good example of homeostasis. Okay, moving on. All right, so we have two kinds of bone. Compact bone is probably what you normally think about as being bone. So when I think of my humerus, the long part of the bone, this is a long bone, but the longest part here is made up almost exclusively of compact bone. And it's on the ends of this humerus where it is articulating with our shoulder bones and then, of course, with our lower arm bones that we have spongy bone. So the spongy bone, as it kind of brings to mind, has a lot more spaces between the bone. It's lightweight, but it's very strong, and it's filled with bone marrow. Our compact bone, as we saw in a previous slide that showed you this thing that looked like a tree trunk, that is the osteon, and the compact bone is made up of repeating osteons that are essentially creating that structure. The osteons are connected with one another, and then there's a high number of connections within the osteon itself. Now, I don't know if you remember seeing the dark black circle in the center of the osteon. This is the central canal. So this is where the blood vessels are running because bone is alive, and we need to be supplying it with a blood supply as well as nerves. Okay, bone cells, you probably already caught this, are the osteocytes. All right, so then we have this really bizarre type of connective tissue, the fluid connective tissue. So the two kinds of fluid connective tissue are blood and lymph, kind of its cousin. So blood has as its matrix, as I mentioned before, the plasma, or the kind of the watery nutrient version of the blood. And then we have what we call the formed elements, which are the blood cells. So white blood cells for immunity, red blood cells to have that hemoglobin and carry oxygen, and lastly, the platelets are what we call the thrombocytes, which are little pieces of cells that are going to clot the blood. So erythrocyte is a red blood cell, leukocyte, white blood cell, and then thrombocyte, also known as the platelet. So here we can see a figure of that. You can pause and study if you want. Okay, functions of the blood. Number one, red blood cells carrying oxygen to the tissue. Blood is also carrying in it the plasma. So the plasma is full of nutrients. It's also carrying carbon dioxide and waste from tissues. So the blood is like we know it's absolutely necessary for life. Now, blood vessels can alter so they can expand when it's hot outside, so we can eliminate more heat at the surface of our body. And when it's cold outside, our blood vessels are going to shrink. So they're going to constrict the flow of blood to our extremities, because if it's cold outside, we're just going to get colder, and instead it shuttles that blood and keeps it essentially bathing the vital organs. So we know that blood is really important for distributing heat, and yet that was another example of homeostasis. And lastly, we know that blood has a role in fluid, ion, and pH balance. So we were talking about fluids earlier, giving a patient fluids. And so certainly we know that blood is super important to keeping our ions, pH in balance. Okay, this other fluid connected tissue, the lymph. So you know lymph, like you have your lymph nodes. The lymph nodes are connected to lymphatic vessels, and essentially what they're doing is they are absorbing any excess interstitial fluid and returns it to the lymph and back to the cardiovascular system. Okay, so the lymph itself usually is clear yellow fluid because of this interstitial fluid that it is absorbing. It should not have a lot of color, like a lot of thinking about dark colors and so on, but it's just clear yellow fluid, and it contains the white blood cells. So lymph, like I said, is the cousin to our blood. So it uses the cardiovascular system to help reabsorb it. And we know that our lymph nodes tell us when we have an infection in an area of our body because they enlarge due to the white blood cells there. Of course, also the interstitial fluid that's being absorbed from that infected tissue. All right, muscle tissue. So muscular tissue functions in contraction. So we have muscle fibers. The fibers include actin and myosin filaments, and it's the sliding back and forth of the actin and myosin filaments through the sliding filament theory that causes that muscle cell to shorten, and when the muscle cell shortens, it's what we call contraction. Relaxation is when it's able to go back out to its full size. So we have three types of muscle tissue. You're probably most familiar with skeletal. So that's all the muscle associated with your skeleton. And then we have smooth, associated with most of your internal organs except for the heart. And then comes the cardiac muscle. So let's take a look. Skeletal muscle is attaching, we can attach the muscle to the skeleton through our tendons. And so we know that the movement of the skeletal muscle is going to move the skeleton. The really cool thing about skeletal muscle is that you can voluntarily control it. So I can choose to use my fingers when I'm talking or lecturing. I can choose to go to the gym and work out my biceps, my triceps, my lats, whatever. So these are voluntarily controlled. Muscle fibers can be very long and can actually run the entire length of the muscle. When we look at muscle tissue underneath a microscope, they're going to have this striped appearance, which tells us a lot about it, and I can tell you more in just a moment. Here we see it. So skeletal muscle has these stripes, and this is representing the actin and the myosin filaments. And essentially, it's giving us an idea of the functional unit that's responsible for a muscle to contract. So this is magnified 250 times. So you might imagine that it takes coordination between all of the little stripes all the way down this muscle to cause a contraction. Smooth muscle in your esophagus, it's in your stomach, in your small intestine, even your urethra. So smooth muscle does not have striations. It's not going to contract the same way, and you cannot control it. So it's involuntary. So smooth muscle is super important. Mentioned many of those organs of the body, but it's also in your blood vessels, and is super important to keeping your blood moving in the direction that it needs to. So looking at a slide of this, what you see is no stripes, so no striations. You see a little bit different shape to that smooth muscle. So remember, structure determines function. So here's a really good example of that. Lastly, cardiac muscle in your heart. Super awesome because it is striated, which allows rapid impulses to be sent. But the other thing about it is it's involuntary. So you can't speed up or slow down your heart. Certainly you can relax yourself to slow down the heart, but you certainly can't control it directly. And what we're going to see is that the cardiac muscle is highly branched. So it's hard to kind of see this, but if you kind of follow it along, you kind of see this branching pattern of the cells. And what we have here is essentially a mechanism to rapidly perpetuate the electrical signal across the heart. So if it's branching and branching and branching, it's going to be a lot quicker than it's just one cell to another cell to another cell. Okay, nervous tissue. So nervous tissue is part of our brain and our spinal cords and our receptors and nerves. And essentially we know that nervous tissue is responsible for rapidly communicating information around the body. So this is both sensory input from your senses, but also motor input. So where's your body in space, moving your body, that sort of thing. And then of course, what we call integration. So taking all the signals and making sense of it. So we have both the nerve cells, the neurons, and then the neuroglia. Okay. So our neuron has short extensions that collect information into that particular neuron or the neuron cell body. That cell body is going to translate that information or integrate it and figure out what to do with it. Not all neurons are going to respond to every single signal that they receive. Then that signal is sent down the axon, which sends the signal away from that cell body to the synapse, where it is going to likely be in communication with a nearby neuron. Okay. Many of our neurons have a fatty layer called myelin, and this is going to help insulate the neurons so our nerve signals are sent nice and smoothly. And we know that when we bundle our axons together, we make our nerves. So you've got your spinal nerves, your cervical nerves, and so on. So super important the way that our nervous system is structured. So here we see a slide. Here's the cell body. Here's the cell body. They're kind of magnifying these dendrites so you can see these short extensions that receive the signal into this neuron. You can see the axon covered in its fatty layer, the myelin sheath, which is insulating, allowing the electrical signal to move along the axon smoothly. And then you get down to the end where we call this the synapses. And this is where we are converting that electrical signal into a chemical signal with the use of neurotransmitters. Okay, neuroglia. These are the cells that support and nourish neurons. So they actually outnumber neurons. They take up more than half the volume of your brain. There's no axons or dendrites. So you might have heard that someone had cancer of the glia. So this is referring to this neuroglia. It's a very hard cancer to treat. So there's some examples there, the microglia, astrocytes, and oligodendrocytes, which are super important to supporting and nourishing our neurons. So the neurons are making up this our last tissue type, is the epithelial tissue. So it's covering the outside of the body and lining our cavities, your oral cavity, your digestive tract, and so on. Super important. And the epithelial tissue is always going to be anchored by a basement membrane on one side and free on the other side. Okay, so we can have single layers of epithelial tissue we call simple, or they can be multiple layers. Like if you go in and see your hairdresser say, hey, I'd like some layers, you could say, hey, can you stratify my hair? And they also come in different shapes. I want to show you the shapes. So here we have our flat squashed cells called squamous shaped epithelial tissue. We have cube shaped in one dimension. You're going to see it just looks like a square, but it's actually three-dimensional, cuboidal. And then we have column shaped. Again, this one is flat, rectangle, and when it's in 3 dimensions, you see that column. Of course, these cells can just be a simple layer. So we have simple cuboidal epithelial tissue in our kidney tubules. We have pseudostratified columnar, so it looks like it's stratified or layered, but it really isn't. It's just kind of cells kind of like mushing on top of each other. This is located in your trachea. And then this one, the stratified, we have stratified epithelial tissue that makes up our skins, literally just sloughing off all the time. So our epithelial tissue can be a simple layer of any one of these. It can look like a complex stratified layer, but not be. So we call this pseudostratified. And this one happens to be column shaped right here. And then lastly, we have true stratified epithelial tissue. For the remaining part of the study guide, I would like for you all to be looking in your textbook for this. So this includes anatomical terms, examples of organ systems, body cavities, and lastly, body membranes. Of course, you can pause any of these slides and get notes from them from my video. Thank you. Have a good week.